The morning mist clung to the hills surrounding Camp Morrison like a shroud, but nothing could hide the precision of that single shot. One bullet, one impossible angle, one sniper who shouldn't have existed. For 8 years, everyone believed Staff Sergeant Allison Adams had vanished without a trace during a classified operation in Afghanistan. Her name was etched on the memorial wall. Her family had buried an empty casket. Her unit had moved on, carrying the weight of a soldier lost to the shadows of war. But at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning in Colorado, someone saved 12 lives with a shot that defied every law of physics and probability. Someone who knew exactly where to be, exactly when to be there, and exactly how to pull off the impossible. The question that would haunt Camp Morrison for months wasn't who fired that shot. It was how a ghost learned to shoot like Allison Adams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Autumn air at Camp Morrison carried the familiar sounds of military routine as the morning shift reported for duty. Sergeant First Class Marcus Rivera shouldered his pack and nodded to the other members of the base security team as they gathered near the main gate. The Colorado mountains provided a stunning backdrop to what had become, for most personnel, just another day of perimeter checks and standard protocols. "Did you hear about the new civilian contractor they brought in?" Rivera asked, adjusting his radio headset. Specialist James Cooper rolled his eyes as he checked his equipment. "Another one? What is it this time? Cybersecurity? Logistics optimization?" He made air quotes around the last 2 words, his tone dripping with the skepticism that came from years of watching consultants arrive with fancy credentials and zero real-world experience. "Some kind of tactical assessment specialist," Rivera shrugged. "Supposed to evaluate our defensive positions and recommend improvements to base security." Private First Class Sarah Martinez laughed as she secured her gear. "Great. Another desk jockey who's probably never held a rifle telling us how to do our jobs. I bet they've never even been in a firefight." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a figure walking across the compound. The person heading toward them wasn't what anyone expected. No pressed military uniform with campaign ribbons and unit patches. No expensive suit with a briefcase full of PowerPoint presentations. Instead, a woman in her early 30s, wearing simple hiking boots, cargo pants, and a plain olive green jacket, moved quietly toward the security checkpoint. She carried only a worn leather messenger bag and a government-issued tablet. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her movements had an economy of motion that suggested someone comfortable with long distances and rough terrain. Nothing about her commanded immediate attention or respect. No name tag, no visible credentials, nothing but the steady, measured pace of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. "That's her," whispered Cooper to Rivera. "Doesn't look like much." Rivera studied the approaching figure with the trained eye of someone who'd spent 15 years in military service. Probably never seen combat. These contractor types are all the same book smart, but no real experience. The woman, whose visitor badge identified her as a Carter, according to the brief glimpse Martinez caught, moved methodically toward their station. She seemed to take no notice of the sideways glances and whispered comments from the security team. Her focus appeared entirely on the base layout around her, occasionally making notes on her tablet while observing sight lines, defensive positions, and patrol routes. When she approached the main security checkpoint where Cooper was conducting equipment inspections, she paused, watching silently as he performed routine maintenance on the automated surveillance system. The camera array that monitored the eastern approach had been acting up for weeks, requiring constant manual adjustments to maintain proper coverage. "Something I can help you with, ma'am?" Cooper asked, not bothering to hide his annoyance at being observed by someone he assumed knew nothing about his job. The contractor, who had introduced herself simply as Carter when she'd checked in that morning, replied quietly, "just observing current security protocols." Cooper resumed his work, deliberately turning his back to her as he struggled with the camera's calibration settings. "Standard perimeter monitoring," he said dismissively. "Nothing complicated." Carter said nothing, but after observing for another moment, she moved closer and pointed to a specific adjustment on the control panel. "The mounting bracket is loose on the eastern unit. That's why your coverage keeps shifting." Cooper looked where she was pointing and realized she was absolutely right. The issue he'd been trying to solve with software adjustments was actually a simple hardware problem. A few minutes with a wrench confirmed her diagnosis. The camera stabilized immediately once the mounting was properly secured. "How did you know that?" Cooper asked, studying her face more carefully. "Experience," Carter replied simply, already moving on to observe the next security station. Staff Sergeant Rivera, who had been watching the exchange, approached Cooper after Carter moved away. "Careful with that one," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Cooper asked, still processing how the contractor had spotted a problem he'd been struggling with for weeks. Rivera shrugged, but his expression was thoughtful. "Something's different about her. Civilian contractors don't usually diagnose equipment problems that fast, especially not tactical surveillance systems." As the morning progressed, Carter continued her methodical assessment of the base's defensive positions. She moved with an efficiency that suggested familiarity with military installations, though she wore no insignia or indication of any service background. The security personnel gradually returned to their duties, though many kept casting curious glances in her direction. During the lunch break, Rivera pulled up Carter's credentials on the secure terminal. The screen displayed minimal information. Tactical Assessment Consultant, Department of Defense Contractor. Her clearance level was higher than expected for a civilian, but beyond that, the system showed almost nothing about her background or qualifications. "That's it?" Cooper asked, peering over Rivera's shoulder. "No previous contracts, no company affiliation, no biography?" Rivera shook his head. "Nothing accessible at our clearance level. It's like she appeared out of nowhere." Martinez pulled out her phone and ran a quick internet search for their contractor's name. The results were frustratingly sparse. No LinkedIn profile, no professional website, no social media presence. Who doesn't have any digital footprint these days? She muttered. "Someone who doesn't want to be found," Rivera said thoughtfully. Across the compound, Carter continued her assessment, seemingly oblivious to the growing curiosity about her identity. She had positioned herself near the base's communications tower, studying the surrounding terrain through a pair of standard-issue binoculars. For just a moment, as she scanned the distant hills, something changed in her posture. Her movements became more focused, more purposeful. She held the binoculars steady on a specific ridgeline for several minutes, then made detailed notes on her tablet. The casual observer might have missed it, but Rivera, watching from across the courtyard, noticed the subtle shift. For those few minutes, Carter moved less like a contractor and more like someone conducting reconnaissance. The afternoon brought new questions when an emergency communication drill was announced. As personnel moved to their assigned positions, Carter moved without hesitation to an observation point that provided optimal overwatch of the entire exercise. Her positioning was perfect, not where a civilian observer should be, but exactly where a trained professional would want to monitor multiple sectors simultaneously. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the base's intelligence officer, noticed Carter's instinctive positioning during the drill. Something about the contractor's movement pattern seemed familiar, though she couldn't place why. After the exercise concluded, Walsh discreetly accessed a secure database and began searching through archived personnel files. What she found made her pause. Buried in classified records from 8 years ago was a file marked Operation Silent Watch Personnel Missing in Action. The file contained a list of soldiers who had disappeared during a classified reconnaissance mission in Afghanistan. Most of the names meant nothing to Walsh, but one made her blood run cold. Staff Sergeant Allison Adams, designated marksman, status, missing, presumed dead. The accompanying photo showed a younger woman in military fatigues, but the bone structure, the eyes, the general build, it could have been Carter's sister. Or it could have been Carter herself, 8 years older and carefully trying to blend into civilian life. Walsh stared at the screen, then looked across the compound where Carter continued her quiet assessment of base defenses. The pieces didn't quite fit together yet, but something was definitely not right about their tactical consultant. How could someone who had supposedly died in Afghanistan 8 years ago be conducting security assessments in Colorado today? As the day ended and Carter prepared to leave, she paused near the base's memorial wall, a black granite surface engraved with the names of personnel killed in action over the past decade. Her hand rested briefly on the stone, and for just a moment, the professional mask slipped. In that instant, she looked less like a civilian contractor and more like someone visiting the grave of a friend, or perhaps visiting her own name, carved in stone and surrounded by the names of soldiers who had died believing she was dead too. The truth was hidden beneath layers of classified operations and bureaucratic fiction, but it was closer to the surface than anyone realized. Someone was watching Camp Morrison very carefully, and they had been doing so for much longer than a single day's security assessment. The woman who called herself Carter walked toward the main gate, her assessment apparently complete. But as she reached the perimeter, she stopped and turned back toward the hills surrounding the base. For several seconds, she studied the terrain with the intensity of someone memorizing details that might matter later. Then she disappeared into a gathering dusk, leaving behind more questions than answers. What nobody knew yet was that their mysterious contractor had been watching Camp Morrison for months. And what they definitely didn't know was that in less than 12 hours, someone would need a sniper who didn't officially exist to save a dozen lives with a single, impossible shot. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning arrived with an unusual tension hanging over Camp Morrison. Carter returned precisely at 0600, once again carrying her worn leather messenger bag and government tablet. But today felt different. The easy dismissal from the previous day had been replaced by wary curiosity from the security personnel, who had witnessed her uncanny ability to diagnose problems they couldn't solve. Sergeant First Class Rivera was the first to notice the change in dynamics. As Carter approached the communication center, he found himself straightening unconsciously, his casual demeanor from yesterday nowhere to be found. The other personnel had clearly been talking. Word traveled fast on a military base, especially when it involved someone who didn't fit the usual contractor profile. "Morning, ma'am," Rivera said, his tone notably more respectful than before. Carter nodded in acknowledgement, then surprised him with a specific technical question. "Sergeant, how's the signal strength holding on the northern relay tower? I noticed some interference patterns yesterday that might indicate equipment degradation." Rivera blinked. Yesterday, she'd been asking general questions about security protocols. Today, she was inquiring about specific technical details that weren't part of any standard tactical assessment. The northern relay had indeed been experiencing intermittent signal drops, but that information wasn't in any of the reports she should have had access to. "Signal's been solid at 92%, ma'am," he replied automatically, then caught himself. "Though we have been seeing some fluctuation during peak transmission periods." "Ma'am, that level of detail isn't typically part of a security evaluation." "Isn't it?" Carter made a note on her tablet. "I find communication reliability often indicates overall defensive readiness." Her response was casual, But Rivera noticed she deflected rather than answered his implied question about how she knew about problems that weren't in any official documentation. Across the compound, Specialist Cooper was having his own unsettling encounter. Carter had stopped beside him as he worked on the base's early warning radar system, but instead of simply observing, she'd begun pointing out potential vulnerabilities that weren't in any standard security manual. The radar array has a blind spot at approximately 270 degrees, she mentioned casually, gesturing toward a specific sector of the surrounding hills. Enemy approach from that direction would remain undetected until they reached the 800-meter perimeter. Cooper paused his diagnostic routine, multimeter halfway to a circuit board. "Ma'am, respectfully, that tactical analysis isn't part of equipment maintenance. Those calculations would require detailed topographical knowledge and advanced training in defensive positioning." "Of course," Carter agreed. "I'm just noting potential areas for improvement in your security posture." But her observations were too precise, too technical. Cooper exchanged glances with nearby personnel, all of whom were beginning to realize their civilian contractor knew far more about military tactics than any outside consultant should. Captain Walsh had spent the night researching what little she could find about Operation Silent Watch. The details were heavily classified, but she'd managed to piece together fragments through her intelligence channels. A deep reconnaissance mission 8 years ago in Afghanistan's Kunar province. A unit that had gone dark during what should have been a routine observation post establishment. Multiple personnel listed as missing in action, presumed dead. The mission's aftermath had been shrouded in secrecy. No bodies recovered. No detailed after-action reports in the accessible files. Just a list of names that had been quietly transferred from active duty to memorial status. But something about the timing bothered Walsh. The disappearances had occurred just 3 days before a major Taliban offensive that coalition forces had somehow anticipated and countered with unusual effectiveness. She approached Carter during her mid-morning inspection of the motor pool area. "Miss Carter," she said carefully, "I noticed you seem particularly familiar with defensive tactics for someone in tactical assessment." Carter didn't look up from her tablet, where she was documenting vehicle positioning and maintenance schedules. "I've studied military doctrine extensively, Captain. Have you?" Walsh moved closer, lowering her voice. "Because the way you analyze sight lines, the questions you're asking about communication protocols, it's not like someone who learned from textbooks. It's like someone who's actually planned defensive operations. For the first time since arriving." Carter's professional composure flickered slightly. She met Walsh's eyes directly, and the intelligence officer saw something there, not fear, but a careful assessment of risk and opportunity. "I take my consulting work seriously, Captain," Carter said finally. "Effective security assessment requires understanding how systems function under stress." "I'm sure it does," Walsh nodded slowly. "It's just that in my 12 years of intelligence work, I've only seen that level of intuitive tactical understanding from personnel who've actually been in combat. Extended combat." The words hung in the air between them. Carter resumed her documentation without responding, but Walsh noticed. Her movements had become more deliberate, more guarded. The casual contractor facade was becoming harder to maintain under direct scrutiny. Meanwhile, Private Martinez had been conducting her own investigation. During lunch, she'd called a contact at the Pentagon, a former drill instructor who now worked in personnel records. "I need you to run a background check for me," Martinez had said quietly into her phone. "Name's a Carter, supposed to be a DOD contractor working tactical assessment." The response had been immediate and troubling. "Martinez, that name isn't in our contractor database. No active contracts, no background clearance records, no employment history with any of our approved consulting firms. Whoever this person is, they're not who they claim to be." When Martinez returned to the compound, she found Carter examining The base's ammunition storage facility, an area that definitely wasn't part of any routine security assessment. The storage bunkers were classified areas that required special authorization to access, yet Carter was documenting them with the detailed attention of someone conducting a military inventory. "Interesting area to evaluate," Martinez commented. Approaching slowly. Carter didn't seem surprised by her presence, though she'd approached from a direction that should have been outside the contractor's peripheral vision. "Ammunition security is a critical component of base defense," Carter replied without looking up from her tablet. "It is," Martinez agreed. "But civilian contractors typically don't have clearance to conduct detailed assessments of munitions storage. Those facilities are restricted to military personnel with specific authorization." Carter's fingers paused over her tablet. "I have the appropriate clearances for my assessment private. Do you?" Martinez pulled out her phone, showing Carter the screen where she'd been researching contractor databases. "Because when I tried to verify your background, I couldn't find any record of a Carter in the Defense Department's approved contractor registry. No employment history, no security clearance documentation, no company affiliation." The afternoon brought an unexpected complication when Colonel Benjamin Hayes, the base commander, arrived for an unscheduled inspection accompanied by two officers Martinez didn't recognize. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere around. "Camp Morrison, where's our tactical assessment contractor?" Hayes asked Captain Walsh. "Over by the vehicle maintenance area, sir," Walsh replied, gesturing toward Carter. "She's been conducting a thorough evaluation of our defensive capabilities." Hayes studied Carter from across the compound, his expression unreadable. "How long has she been here?" "This is her second day, sir. Yesterday she seemed like a routine contractor, but today double quotes." Walsh hesitated. "Today she's demonstrating knowledge and asking questions that suggest extensive operational experience with military installations." One of the officers with Hayes, a stern-faced man with military intelligence insignia, spoke quietly. "Sir, we should speak with her directly. The contractor situation has developed some complications." As the group approached, Carter seemed to sense their presence before they were within normal detection range. She looked up from her tablet, and for just a moment, her professional mask slipped completely. The expression that crossed her face was one of recognition followed immediately by resignation, the look of someone who had been expecting this confrontation but hoping it wouldn't come so soon. "Miss Carter," Colonel Hayes called out, "could we have a word?" Carter straightened, and Martinez noticed that her posture suddenly changed from civilian contractor to something that looked distinctly like military bearing. "Of course, Colonel." The entire compound seemed to hold its breath as the group moved toward the base headquarters building. Through the windows of the conference room, personnel could see an intense discussion taking place, but the soundproofing prevented anyone from making out specific words. The body language was telling, though Carter stood at what appeared to be attention while the officers consulted tablets and classified documents. Cooper moved closer to Rivera. "Think she's in trouble?" "I think," Rivera said slowly, watching the heated discussion through the windows, "we're about to find out who she really is. And I have a feeling it's going to change everything we thought we knew about tactical assessment contractors." Inside the conference room, Colonel Hayes was reviewing a classified file on his tablet. The contents were making his expression increasingly grim as he cross-referenced information that should have been impossible to reconcile. What they had discovered about their mysterious contractor was about to turn Camp Morrison upside down. The woman they had dismissed as just another civilian consultant was hiding something that went far beyond unauthorized access to military facilities. And in less than 6 hours, that secret would become the difference between life and death. For a dozen soldiers who had no idea their salvation was standing in a conference room, trying to decide whether to maintain a cover story that was rapidly falling apart. The conference room at Camp Morrison had become a pressure cooker of classified Information and impossible questions. Colonel Hayes sat across from Carter. A thick file spread open between them, while the two intelligence officers flanked the table like sentries, guarding state secrets. The tension was so thick it could have been cut with a combat knife. Staff Sergeant Allison Adams. Colonel Hayes read from the file, his voice carefully controlled. Designated marksman, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Officially declared missing in action 8 years ago during Operation Silent Watch. Memorial service attended by over 200 personnel. Carter or Allison, as her true identity was now laid bare, sat perfectly still. The civilian contractor facade had been completely abandoned, replaced by the rigid posture of a soldier facing formal interrogation. Sir, Staff Sergeant Adams was lost during that operation. What remained was classified too highly to continue existing officially. The intelligence officer to Hayes's left, Major David Chun, leaned forward with barely contained intensity. Sergeant Adams, your service record shows you were the unit's primary sniper during the Kunar Province operation. Your spotter, Corporal Michael Torres, was recovered 3 days after the unit went missing. He reported that you had remained in position to provide covering fire while the rest of the team evacuated under heavy enemy contact. Torres made it out, Allison replied carefully. That was what mattered. But you didn't, the second intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Rodriguez, interjected. According to Torres's debriefing, you were overrun by Taliban forces while maintaining your position. He heard the firefight continue for 6 hours after visual contact was lost. When the area was finally secured 2 weeks later, no trace of you or your equipment was found. Hayes consulted another section of the file. The official determination was that you had been killed in action, your body either destroyed in the fighting or removed by enemy forces. Your family was notified. Your personal effects were returned. Your name was added to the memorial wall at Fort Bragg. For the first time since the interrogation began, emotion flickered across Allison's face. My family needed closure, sir. The Army needed a clean end to a classified operation that had gone wrong. Sometimes the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. Major Chun's expression hardened. Sergeant, you've been operating under false identities for 8 years. Federal records show Carter has existed for exactly 7 years and 11 months, with a background that appears completely fabricated. Where have you been? What have you been doing? And who authorized your continued operation? The questions hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Outside the conference room, the normal activities of Camp Morrison continued. But inside this small space, the foundations of military record-keeping and personnel accountability were being systematically dismantled. After Kunar Province, Allison began slowly. I was extracted by assets that don't officially exist. The operation had uncovered intelligence networks that required unconventional responses. My death provided the perfect cover for operations that needed to remain completely deniable. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez consulted her tablet. Operations, plural? Sergeant, we've been tracking unusual activities at 17 different military installations over the past 8 years. Security assessments conducted by various contractors, all of whom seem to have remarkably similar expertise, and all of whom disappear from public records after their contracts end. Hayes turned to a new page in the file. Rebecca Stone at Fort Carson, Jennifer Blake at Marine Corps Base Quantico, Sarah Mitchell at Naval Station Norfolk. All civilian contractors, all specializing in tactical assessment, all possessing knowledge. That suggests extensive military experience. All the same person, Allison confirmed. All me. The admission sent shockwaves through the room. Chun stood up and began pacing, his frustration evident. Sergeant, do you understand the magnitude of what you're describing? You've been conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering at some of the most sensitive military installations in the country. That's espionage. That's treason. No, sir, Allison replied firmly. That's preparation. The single word stopped Chun's pacing cold. Preparation for what? For the first time since the interrogation began, Allison allowed herself a slight smile, not of amusement, but of grim satisfaction. For the moments when the official channels fail, when bureaucracy gets soldiers killed, when someone needs to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to save lives that the system can't protect. Hayes leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. You're describing a shadow operation that has no oversight, no authorization, no accountability. How do we know you're not working for foreign intelligence services? How do we know this isn't an elaborate infiltration scheme? Because, Allison said, reaching into her jacket pocket with careful, deliberate movements, I still carry this. She placed a small, worn object on the table, a faded Ranger tab, creased and stained with what might have been blood. This belonged to Sergeant First Class Tommy Richardson. He died in my arms during the Cooner operation, killed by sniper fire that I should have prevented. I've carried it for 8 years as a reminder of what happens when soldiers don't have the support they need. The room fell silent. Richardson's name was in the file, listed among the confirmed casualties from Operation Silent Watch. His death had been one of the factors that led to the operation being classified and the surviving personnel being reassigned to different units. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez spoke quietly. Sergeant Richardson's family was told he died heroically defending his position. He did, Allison replied. But he died because our intelligence was wrong, our backup was delayed, and our extraction was compromised. 3 failures that cost 5 good soldiers their lives. I decided that night that I would spend whatever time I had left making sure those kinds of failures didn't happen again. Major Chun sat back down, his anger replaced by something that might have been understanding. So you became a ghost. Moving from base to base, identifying weaknesses, preparing for crises that might never come. Crises that do come, Allison corrected. Fort Carson had a security breach 6 months after my assessment there. The recommendations I'd made prevented it from becoming a catastrophe. Quantico faced a terrorist probe that failed because their defensive improvements had been implemented based on my report. Norfolk's communication system saved a destroyer during a storm because someone had upgraded their relay equipment. Hayes consulted his tablet. These improvements, they were all implemented by the base personnel themselves. I provided observations. They made their own decisions about implementation. I never forced anything, never operated outside proper channels. Once my assessments were complete, I just pointed out problems that needed attention. The intelligence officers exchanged glances. What Allison was describing wasn't traditional espionage. It was something far more complex and potentially more valuable. A single operator, officially dead, moving through the military system and identifying vulnerabilities before they could be exploited by enemies or cost American lives. But why this secrecy? Rodriguez asked. Why not come forward, clear your official status, and do this work through proper channels? Allison's expression darkened. Because, ma'am, proper channels are what got Tommy Richardson and 4 other Rangers killed in Cooner Province. Proper channels said our intelligence was solid. Proper channels said backup was 10 minutes out. Proper channels said extraction was confirmed. All 3 were lies, and good soldiers died because of those lies. Colonel Hayes closed the file and looked directly at Allison. Sergeant, what you're describing is a fundamental lack of trust in your own chain of command. That's a serious allegation. Sir, it's not an allegation. It's a fact proven by 8 years of successful operations that the official system said were impossible. Allison leaned forward slightly. How many soldiers are alive today because someone identified problems before they became disasters? How many families still have their sons and daughters because a dead woman spent 8 years making sure our people were protected? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Outside, the sounds of evening formation could be heard as Camp Morrison's personnel prepared for the end of another duty day. But inside the conference room, 4 people were grappling with the implications of a ghost who had spent 8 years haunting the military system. Not to damage it, but to make it stronger. Major Chun spoke first. Sergeant, assuming we accept your explanation, there's still the matter of your current status. You can't remain dead indefinitely. And you certainly can't continue operating under false identities. I know, sir, Allison replied. That's why I came to Camp Morrison. This was going to be my last assessment. 8 years is long enough to serve as a ghost. It was time to resurface. Hayes frowned. What made you choose this location for your final operation? For the first time since the interrogation began, Allison looked uncertain. Intelligence patterns, sir. Communication intercepts, personnel movements, equipment positioning. Camp Morrison is being set up for something big, something that's not in any official planning documents. And based on what I've observed over the past 2 days. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Sir, I believe this base is about to become the target of a coordinated attack. And I don't think the people responsible realize that someone has been watching them prepare for weeks. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Hayes and his intelligence officers exchanged looks that confirmed Allison's worst fears. She had stumbled onto something that was even more classified than her own ghost operation. Sergeant, Colonel Hayes said quietly, I think we need to discuss what you've observed. Because you may be the only person in position to prevent a disaster that could make Kunar Province look like a training exercise. The secure briefing room, deep within Camp Morrison's headquarters, had been transformed into an impromptu war room. Maps covered every available surface, satellite feeds streamed across multiple monitors, and the air was thick with the tension that comes when theoretical threats become operational reality. Colonel Hayes stood at the head of a long table, surrounded by his intelligence team and the woman who had spent 8 years operating in the shadows of the military system. Show us what you've observed, Hayes commanded, gesturing toward the tactical display screen that dominated one wall. Allison moved to the front of the room, her demeanor completely transformed from the quiet contractor who had arrived just 2 days earlier. Now she stood like the seasoned combat veteran she truly was, ready to brief officers on intelligence that could mean the difference between life and death. 3 weeks ago, I began monitoring unusual electronic signatures in the surrounding area, Allison began, using a laser pointer to highlight specific locations on the topographical map. Cell phone communications using encryption patterns that don't match any known civilian or military protocols. The signals were coming from these 4 positions in the hills overlooking the base. Major Chun studied the marked locations. Those are all within effective small arms range of critical facilities. Communication center, motor pool, ammunition storage, command headquarters. Exactly, sir, but it gets worse. Allison switched to a different display showing vehicle movement patterns. Over the past 10 days, I've documented 17 instances of the same 5 vehicles, conducting what appears to be reconnaissance runs along the access roads to Camp Morrison. Different times, different routes, but always stopping at positions that provide direct line of sight to base entrances and defensive positions. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression grim. Surveillance pattern consistent. With attack planning, what else? Allison pulled up a series of photographs on her tablet, projecting them onto the screen. Personnel movements. I've identified at least 12 individuals who have been conducting systematic observation of base activities. They're using standard civilian cover hikers, hunters, photography enthusiasts, but their movement patterns and equipment are consistent with military reconnaissance. Captain Walsh, who had joined the briefing when her intelligence expertise became necessary, studied the photos carefully. These are high-quality surveillance images. How did you manage to photograph them without being detected? For the first time since beginning her briefing, Allison allowed herself a slight smile. 8 years of practice, Captain. When you're officially dead, you get very good at being invisible. Hayes consulted a classified document that had been rushed to the briefing room. Sergeant Adams, what you're describing aligns with intelligence we've been receiving from other sources. There are indications that a domestic terrorist cell has been planning an attack on a military installation in this region. We weren't sure which facility was the target. It's Camp Morrison, sir, Allison said with certainty. Everything I've observed points to a coordinated assault designed to inflict maximum casualties and capture classified materials. Based on the reconnaissance patterns, I estimate they're planning to strike within the next 48 hours. Major Chun pulled up base security protocols on his laptop. Our standard defensive measures should be adequate to repel most types of assault. We have early warning systems, rapid response teams, and close air support available from Peterson Air Force Base. With respect, sir, your defensive measures are designed for conventional threats, Allison replied. What I've observed suggests these people have detailed knowledge of your security protocols. They know where your cameras are positioned, they know your patrol schedules, and they know the blind spots in your perimeter defense. This isn't a random attack, it's a precision operation planned by people who understand how military bases function. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez voiced what everyone was thinking. Inside information. Someone on the base, or someone with access to our operational details, has been feeding intelligence to hostile forces. Hayes's expression darkened. Do you have any indication of who might be compromised? Allison hesitated, then pulled up a new set of data on her tablet. Sir, I've been monitoring communication patterns for 3 weeks. There are encrypted transmissions leaving the base every evening at approximately 2,100 hours. The signals originate from somewhere within the administrative complex and are directed toward the same coordinates where I've observed hostile surveillance teams. Captain Walsh stood up abruptly. Administrative complex. That narrows it down to about 40 personnel, with access to classified information. We need to start a counterintelligence investigation immediately. We don't have time for a formal investigation, Allison said bluntly. If my analysis is correct, the attack will commence tomorrow night during the shift change. That's when base security is at its most vulnerable, and it's when the maximum number of personnel will be in the barracks and common areas. Major Chun was studying the tactical display with growing concern. Maximum casualties. If they hit us during evening formation, they could kill or wound hundreds of soldiers before we could mount an effective response. Hayes turned to his communications officer. Get me General Morrison at Northcom Priority Alpha. We need to discuss immediate defensive reinforcement for Camp Morrison. As the officer began placing the secure call, Hayes looked back at Allison. Sergeant, assuming your intelligence is accurate, what would you recommend for defensive positioning? Allison moved to the tactical map and began indicating specific locations with swift, precise movements. Counter-sniper positions here, and here, she said, marking elevated points that commanded overlapping fields of fire. Additional early warning sensors along these approach routes. Mobile quick reaction forces positioned to respond to multiple breach points simultaneously. And if they do penetrate the perimeter? Rodriguez asked. Then you need someone in overwatch position who can engage priority targets at extended range, Allison replied. Someone who can neutralize hostile snipers and disrupt their assault. Coordination before they can achieve their tactical objectives. The implication was clear. Camp Morrison needed a sniper, and the only person in the room with the skills to fill that role was someone who officially didn't exist. Hayes was quiet for several moments, weighing options that all carried significant risks. Sergeant Adams, if we accept your assessment and prepare defensive measures based on your intelligence, we're essentially betting the lives of everyone on this base on the word of someone who has been operating outside official channels for 8 years. Yes, sir, Allison replied without hesitation. But if you don't accept my assessment and I'm right, those lives will be lost anyway. The difference is that my way, they have a chance. The secure phone rang, interrupting the tense discussion. Hayes answered on the first ring. General Morrison? Yes, sir, we have a developing situation here at Camp Morrison. The conversation that followed was brief but intense, with Hayes providing a condensed version of Allison's intelligence and the threat assessment it represented. When the call ended, Hayes looked around the room at his officers. General Morrison is deploying additional security assets to Camp Morrison, but they won't arrive until tomorrow afternoon. Until then, we're on our own with whatever defensive measures we can implement in the next 18 hours. Captain Walsh consulted her intelligence files. Sir, if we're going to establish counter-sniper positions, we need qualified personnel. Our designated marksmen are currently deployed overseas. The only trained snipers available on base are instructors from the marksmanship program, and none of them have recent combat experience. All eyes turned to Allison, who had been quietly studying the tactical situation while the officers discussed personnel availability. I volunteer for overwatch duty, she said simply. Major Chun shook his head. Sergeant, you're officially dead. You have no current military status, no insurance coverage, no legal protection if this operation goes wrong. We can't authorize you to engage in combat operations. Then don't authorize it, Allison replied. I'll be conducting an unauthorized personal reconnaissance in the hills surrounding the base. If I happen to observe hostile activity and take appropriate defensive action to protect American soldiers, that's just good citizenship. Hayes understood the implication immediately. Completely deniable. No official sanction, no paper trail. No connection to Camp Morrison's command structure. Exactly, sir. The ghost protects the base, and if anything goes wrong, you've never heard of Staff Sergeant Allison Adams, or any of her various contractor identities. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez pulled up personnel files on her laptop. We still need official base personnel in position to coordinate defensive response. This can't be a one-woman operation. Agreed, Allison said. But I can provide early warning and eliminate priority targets before your people engage. Think of it as unofficial fire support. The plan was audacious, risky, and completely outside normal military protocols. But as the officers looked at the intelligence Allison had gathered and considered the alternatives, they realized it might be their best chance of preventing a massacre. Hayes made the decision that would define his career. Sergeant Adams, you have 12 hours to position yourself for overwatch operations. Officially, this conversation never happened. Unofficially ... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Good hunting. As the briefing broke up and officers dispersed to implement defensive measures, Allison remained behind to study the tactical maps one final time. Tomorrow night, she would have to justify 8 years of shadow operations with a single mission. The ghost was about to become very visible indeed. Outside, the sun was setting over Camp Morrison, painting the surrounding hills in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in those hills, hostile forces were making their final preparations for an attack that would either succeed beyond their wildest expectations or fail catastrophically due to a sniper who didn't officially exist. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Allison Adams had learned during 8 years of living in the shadows of the military system. The equipment room beneath Camp Morrison's armory was a place few personnel ever saw. Accessible only through a series of security checkpoints and coded locks, it housed the specialized gear used for the base's most sensitive operations. At 2,300 hours, while most of the base slept, Captain Walsh led Allison through the maze of storage lockers and equipment racks to a section marked Long-Range Reconnaissance. This is everything we can provide without creating an official equipment transfer record, Walsh said quietly, indicating a collection of gear laid out on a metal table. Ghillie suit, night vision optics, range finder, weather monitoring equipment, and enough field rations for 72 hours. Allison examined each item with the methodical attention of someone whose life would depend on their functionality. The ghillie suit was military specification, designed for mountain terrain that matched the hills surrounding Camp Morrison. The night vision system was current generation, compatible with the targeting scope she would need for precision shooting at extended range. What about the rifle? Allison asked, checking the batteries in the rangefinder. Walsh hesitated. That's where things get complicated. We can't officially issue you a weapon. But there's a civilian hunting rifle in the base recreational equipment that's been checked out for an indefinite period. It's not military specification, but it's been modified by our marksmanship instructors for long-range accuracy. She led Allison to another locker containing a bolt-action rifle with a high-powered scope and custom modifications that made it suitable for precision shooting at distances exceeding 800 meters. The weapon isn't registered to any official user, and the ammunition comes from training supplies that are considered expended. Allison lifted the rifle, checking its balance and examining the scope adjustments. What's the effective range? The right hands confirmed hits at 1,200 meters. The ammunition is match grade, and the scope has been zeroed by our best instructors. Walsh paused, watching Allison's professional assessment of the weapon. Is it adequate for your needs? It'll do, Allison replied, then began field stripping the rifle with practiced efficiency. Every component was inspected, cleaned, and reassembled. Her movements were so fluid and automatic that Walsh realized she was watching someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times under conditions where a mechanical failure could mean death. Meanwhile, in another part of the base, Sergeant Rivera was conducting his own preparation. He had volunteered for the overnight security patrol that would position him closest to Allison's planned overwatch location. Officially, it was routine perimeter security. Unofficially, it would allow him to provide early warning if hostile forces approached the base from unexpected directions. Radio check, Rivera whispered into his headset, testing the encrypted communication system that would connect him to the base command center. Rivera, this is Control, came the reply from Specialist Cooper, who had volunteered for overnight communication duties. Signal strength, 5x5. Weather forecast shows clear skies, minimal wind, temperature dropping to 38 degrees by 0400. The weather information was critical for long-range shooting. Wind speed and direction could affect bullet trajectory at extended distances, and temperature changes could alter the performance of both ammunition and optical equipment. Rivera would monitor conditions throughout the night and relay updates to ensure Allison had the environmental data needed for precision shots. At 0100 hours, Allison began her movement toward the overwatch position she had selected during her reconnaissance. The location was a rocky outcrop approximately 1,500 meters northeast of Camp Morrison, providing clear sight lines to all the approaches she had identified as likely attack routes. The position was defensible, offered concealment from multiple directions, and had escape routes if her location was compromised. The movement to the position took nearly 2 hours. Allison moved with the deliberate care of someone who understood that noise discipline and light discipline were matters of life and death. Every step was calculated to avoid loose rocks. Every pause was used to scan for potential threats. Every movement was designed to leave no trace that could be detected by hostile surveillance. When she reached the Overwatch position, Allison began the methodical process of establishing a sniper hide. The ghillie suit was arranged to break up her human silhouette. The rifle was positioned for optimal fields of fire, and range cards were prepared showing the exact distances to every potential target area around Camp Morrison. "Control, this is Overwatch," she whispered into the radio Walsh had provided. "Position established. Beginning surveillance." "Roger, Overwatch," came Cooper's reply. "Base is secure." No unusual activity reported. But even as Cooper spoke, Allison was observing movement in the hills that contradicted his assessment. Through her night vision scope, she could see at least 6 figures moving through the darkness toward positions that surrounded Camp Morrison. They moved with military precision, using terrain and cover to remain undetected by the base's conventional security systems. "Control, Overwatch. I have visual on hostile movement. Count 6 individuals, move into positions consistent with coordinated attack preparation. Estimate contact in approximately 4 hours. The radio was silent for several seconds before Colonel Hayes' voice came through. "Overwatch, this is command. Can you confirm hostile intent?" Allison adjusted her scope and focused on the nearest group of figures. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. "Command, positive identification on military-grade weapons and equipment. These are not recreational hikers. Repeat, these are armed hostiles preparing for assault." In the command center, Hayes was coordinating with his officers to implement the defensive measures they had planned. Additional security teams were being positioned at critical facilities. Early warning systems were being recalibrated for maximum sensitivity, and rapid response protocols were being activated. "Sir," Major Chun reported, "we've also identified the source of the intelligence leak. Communications analysis shows the encrypted transmissions are originating from the finance office. Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams has been sending classified information to external contacts for the past 3 months. Hayes' expression hardened. "Motive? Financial pressure, sir. She's facing bankruptcy and divorce proceedings. Appears she was recruited by hostile agents who exploited her personal vulnerabilities." Chun consulted his tablet. "She's scheduled to work the night shift tonight, which would give her access to real-time security information during the attack." "Detain her immediately," Hayes ordered, "and change all security protocols she would have had access to." But as military police moved to arrest Williams, Allison was observing developments in the hills that indicated the attack timeline was accelerating. The hostile forces had divided into 3 teams, each moving toward a different sector of Camp Morrison's perimeter. Their coordination and timing suggested they had been monitoring base communications and were aware that their operation had been compromised. "Command, Overwatch. Hostile forces are accelerating their timeline. I count 3 separate assault teams moving to attack positions. Estimate contact within 2 hours, not 4. The news sent shockwaves through the command center. All there. Preparations had been based on having until dawn to finalize defensive measures. Now they were facing an immediate threat with limited time to respond. "Overwatch, can you engage the assault teams from your position?" Hayes asked. Allison studied the tactical situation through her scope. The 3 teams were positioned at ranges between 800 and 1200 meters, all within the effective range of her rifle. But engaging them would require her to reveal her position, potentially compromising the Overwatch advantage that was Camp Morrison's best defense. "Command, I can engage, but once I fire the first shot, my position becomes known. I'll be able to eliminate priority targets, but I won't be able to maintain extended Overwatch." "Understood, Overwatch. Hold position until hostiles initiate contact, then engage at your discretion." As the hours passed, tension throughout Camp Morrison reached unbearable levels. Security teams reported to their positions. Communication protocols were tested one final time. and every person on the base prepared for a battle that could determine whether hundreds of soldiers would see another sunrise. In her hide, Allison monitored the hostile teams as they completed their final preparations. She could see them checking weapons, coordinating watches, and positioning themselves for what appeared to be a simultaneous assault on multiple points around the base perimeter. The level of coordination and equipment suggested these weren't amateur terrorists. They were professionals with military training and significant resources. At 0347 hours, everything changed. The easternmost assault team began moving toward the base perimeter, and Allison realized the attack was beginning. 8 years of preparation, 8 years of shadow operations, 8 years of being a ghost in the military system. It all came down to this moment. She settled behind her rifle, controlled her breathing, and prepared to prove that sometimes the dead can be more dangerous than the living. The first shot would announce to everyone within miles that the ghost sniper was very much alive, and very much ready to protect the soldiers who didn't even know she existed. The battle for Camp Morrison was about to begin, and Allison Adams was about to remind the world why Rangers lead the way. At 0347 hours, the stillness of the Colorado mountains was shattered by the whisper of death, traveling at 3,000 feet per second. Allison's first shot echoed across the valley like thunder, and in that single moment, 8 years of shadows and secrets exploded into deadly clarity. The bullet found its target with surgical precision, the lead sniper of the Eastern Assault Team, positioned 1,150 meters from Camp Morrison's communications center. Through her scope, Allison watched the figure crumple instantly, his weapon tumbling down the rocky slope as his team scrambled for cover, suddenly aware they were being hunted by someone they couldn't see. "Contact! Contact!" screamed voices across the tactical radio frequencies, as the attack that was supposed to be a surprise became a nightmare of confusion and terror. The hostile forces had expected to assault an unprepared military base. Instead, they found themselves under precise fire from a sniper who seemed to know exactly where each team was positioned, and exactly how to dismantle their coordinated attack. In the command center at Camp Morrison, Colonel Hayes felt a surge of grim satisfaction as reports flooded in from his security teams. "Sir, hostile sniper eliminated on the eastern approach," came Sergeant Rivera's voice over the radio. "Overwatch is engaged with confirmed kill." But Allison wasn't finished. The elimination of the Eastern team's sniper had revealed the positions of 2 more hostile operatives, who were now exposed as they attempted to advance on the base perimeter. She adjusted her aim, compensating for wind drift and the slight upward angle of her next target, and squeezed the trigger again. The second shot was even more spectacular than the first. The bullet traveled 980 meters through the thin mountain air and struck the hostile team leader, just as he was coordinating the assault through his radio. The radio transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by panicked shouts from the surviving team members who suddenly realized their carefully planned operation was falling apart. "Command, this is Overwatch." Allison's voice came through the radio with deadly calm. "Eastern team neutralized. 2 confirmed kills, remaining hostiles in full retreat. Shifting to northern sector." Through her scope, she could see the northern assault team had gone to ground, taking cover behind a rocky outcrop approximately 1,200 meters from the base motor pool. They were trying to use the terrain to mask their approach, but Allison had spent 3 weeks studying every inch of the surrounding hills. She knew exactly where they would have to emerge to continue their advance. The third shot came 5 minutes later, as a hostile operative attempted to advance using a dry creek bed for concealment. Allison had anticipated the movement, pre-positioned her rifle to cover the only viable approach route, and fired the moment her target appeared. The range was extreme, 1,247 meters according to her range finder, but the shot was perfect. In the hills surrounding Camp Morrison, the surviving members of the assault teams were experiencing something they had never encountered before: being systematically hunted by a sniper they couldn't locate, couldn't escape, and couldn't fight back against. Their radio communications were filled with panic and confusion as team leaders tried to regroup forces that were rapidly disintegrating under precision fire. Base teams, abort assault. Abort assault, came a desperate transmission on the hostile frequency that Captain Walsh was monitoring. Unknown sniper has overwatch on all approaches. Multiple teams compromised. Repeat, abort assault and initiate extraction. But extraction was easier planned than executed when facing a sniper who had spent 8 years perfecting the art of invisible warfare. As the Western assault team attempted to withdraw from their positions near the ammunition storage facility, Allison was already tracking their movement through her scope. The 4th shot eliminated the Western team's communications specialist just as he was calling for emergency evacuation. The bullet struck at a range of 1,089 meters, and the sudden silence on the hostile communication frequencies told everyone listening that the assault had transformed from a coordinated attack into a desperate fight for survival. "Command, this is Overwatch," Allison reported. "Western team disrupted. Hostile communications appear to be breaking down. Estimate remaining enemy strength at 6 to 8 individuals across all sectors." Major Chun, monitoring the tactical situation from the command center, was watching the elimination of a terrorist attack in real time. "Sir, this is unprecedented. One sniper is single-handedly destroying a coordinated assault by what appears to be a professional military unit." Colonel Hayes nodded grimly. "That's not just any sniper, Major. That's 8 years of training, experience, and motivation focused into a weapon system that the enemy never saw coming." The psychological impact on the attacking forces was becoming as devastating as the physical casualties. These were professionals who had planned their operation for months, studied the base defenses, recruited inside assistance, and positioned themselves for what should have been an overwhelming assault. Instead, they were being picked off one by a ghost who struck without warning and disappeared without trace. The 5th shot came at 04:02 hours, as the remaining members of the northern team attempted to provide covering fire for their withdrawal. Allison had identified the hostile sniper by his muzzle flash and eliminated him with a shot that traveled 1,156 meters through darkness, illuminated only by starlight and night vision optics. "Multiple hostiles down," Rivera reported from his observation post. "I can see figures retreating through the hills, but they're moving in panic, not tactical formation. Whatever coordination they had is completely broken." The transformation was remarkable. In 15 minutes, a carefully orchestrated terrorist attack had been reduced to scattered individuals fleeing for their lives. Through terrain that offered no protection from a sniper who seemed to know their every move before they made it, the 6th and final shot of the engagement eliminated a hostile operative who was attempting to set up a mortar position that could have caused significant casualties on the base. Allison had identified the threat through her scope, calculated the range at 1,098 meters, and fired a shot that prevented what could have been a stating barrage of indirect fire. "Command, this is Overwatch," she reported. "Mortar team neutralized. No hostile activity visible in any sector. Threat appears to be eliminated." The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in hours, the radio frequencies were quiet except for the routine communications of base security teams confirming that Camp Morrison was secure. The attack that was supposed to kill hundreds of soldiers had been stopped by a single sniper who officially didn't exist. In the command center, Colonel Hayes was receiving reports that confirmed what everyone was struggling to believe. "Sir, we have confirmation of 6 hostile casualties across 3 separate engagement areas. No friendly casualties reported. Base security is intact, and all critical facilities are secure." Captain Walsh, who had been monitoring enemy communications throughout the engagement, provided additional intelligence. "Sir, we intercepted several panic transmissions before their communications went dark. The attacking force referred to impossible shots and supernatural accuracy. They were completely demoralized by the sniper engagement. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez consulted her tactical display. "Colonel, what we've witnessed tonight redefines what's possible in defensive sniper operations. 6 confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. In darkness, under time pressure, with no spotting assistance. It's beyond anything in our current tactical doctrine." But the most significant aspect of the engagement wasn't the technical achievement, it was the strategic impact. A terrorist attack designed to inflict mass casualties and capture classified materials had been completely neutralized by a single operator working without official authorization, using equipment that wasn't officially issued in support of a base that officially had no knowledge of her existence. "Sir," Major Chun said quietly, "we need to discuss what happens next. Sergeant Adams has just saved hundreds of lives and prevented a major terrorist attack. But officially, she's still dead, and this engagement never happened." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. The ghost sniper had proven her value beyond any doubt, but bringing her back to official status would require explanations that could compromise operations spanning 8 years and 17 military installations. First priority, Hayes decided, is extraction and debriefing. "We'll worry about the political complications later." He keyed his radio. "Overwatch, this is Command. Outstanding work. Begin extraction to Rally Point Alpha for recovery and debriefing." High in the hills above Camp Morrison, Allison began the methodical process of dismantling her sniper hide and preparing to return to the base. The engagement was over, the threat was eliminated, and her cover was completely blown. After 8 years of being a ghost, she was about to become very visible indeed. As she packed her equipment and prepared for the movement back to base, Allison reflected on the night's work. 6 shots, 6 targets, 6 threats eliminated. It was the kind of precision shooting that legends were made of, but more importantly, it was the vindication of 8 years spent preparing for exactly this kind of moment. The ghost sniper was about to come home. The dawnlight, filtering through the windows of Camp Morrison's secure debriefing room, revealed a scene that would have been impossible to imagine just 24 hours earlier. Allison Adams sat at a metal table, no longer hiding behind the facade of a civilian contractor, facing a panel of officers whose expressions ranged from awe to bewilderment to barely contained excitement about the implications of what they had witnessed. General Patricia Morrison had arrived from Northcom headquarters at 0600, accompanied by a team of intelligence analysts, ballistics experts, and Pentagon officials whose presence indicated that the previous night's engagement had sent shockwaves through the highest levels of military command. The debriefing room looked more like a courtroom than a conference space, with recording equipment, classified documents, and enough brass to outfit a medal ceremony. "Sergeant Adams," General Morrison began, consulting a thick file that had been compiled during the 4 hours since the engagement ended. "Let's start with the technical aspects of last night's operation. 6 targets eliminated at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. In darkness, using a civilian hunting rifle modified for precision shooting. Our ballistics team is calling it impossible." Allison sat perfectly straight, her hands folded on the table. Every inch the professional soldier, despite wearing civilian clothes that were still dusty from her movement through the hills. "General, with respect, it's only impossible if you don't spend 8 years preparing for exactly that scenario." Major General Robert Kane, the Pentagon's chief of sniper operations, leaned forward with intense interest. "Sergeant, I've reviewed the preliminary analysis of your shots. The longest confirmed kill was at 1,247 meters using ammunition that wasn't designed for that range. The mathematical probability of achieving that level of accuracy under those conditions is statistically negligible." "Sir, mathematics don't account for experience, preparation, and motivation," Allison replied. I spent 8 years studying that terrain, learning wind patterns, practicing on similar equipment, and preparing for the day when soldiers would need someone who could make impossible shots. Last night wasn't luck, it was the culmination of a very long training program. Colonel Hayes, who had witnessed the entire operation from the command center, provided context for the Pentagon officials. Generals, what Sergeant Adams accomplished last night goes beyond technical marksmanship. She single-handedly prevented a coordinated terrorist attack that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties and the compromise of classified materials. The strategic impact is unprecedented. General Morrison turned to a new section of her file. That brings us to the larger question, Sergeant. Your unauthorized operations over the past 8 years have taken you to 17 different military installations. You've operated under at least 6 different false identities. You've accessed classified facilities, gathered intelligence on defensive capabilities, and maintained surveillance on potential threats, all without official authorization or oversight. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Allison had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during 8 years of shadow operations. General, I conducted security assessments that identified vulnerabilities and prevented attacks. Every recommendation I made was implemented through official channels by base personnel, who made their own decisions about defensive improvements. I never operated outside legal boundaries once my assessments were complete. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Rodriguez, who had been reviewing intelligence reports throughout the night, provided additional perspective. Ma'am, we've been analyzing the outcomes of Sergeant Adams's previous assignments. Fort Carson implemented security improvements based on her assessment 6 months before a confirmed terrorist probe. Quantico upgraded their communication systems, following her recommendations, which prevented a major security breach. Norfolk's defensive modifications saved lives during Hurricane Martha. Major General Kane studied photographs of the previous night's engagement zone. The question isn't whether Sergeant Adams's operations were effective. They clearly were. The question is whether the military can officially acknowledge and integrate someone who has spent 8 years operating outside normal command structures. General Morrison closed the file and looked directly at Allison. Sergeant, you've put us in an impossible position. Officially acknowledging your survival in operations would require explanations that could compromise national security. But ignoring what you've accomplished would be a disservice to the soldiers you've protected and the intelligence you've gathered. General, Allison replied carefully, I never asked for official acknowledgement. I asked to serve. For 8 years, I've been serving in the only way available to someone who is officially dead. If that service continues to be unofficial, I can accept that. But Captain Walsh, who had spent the night analyzing the broader implications of Allison's operations, had discovered something that changed the entire dynamic of the discussion. Ma'am, there's another factor we need to consider. Our investigation into the terrorist attack revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident. We've identified connections to at least 4 other planned attacks on military installations over the past 2 years. She pulled up a classified presentation on the briefing room's display screen. Fort Bragg, Marine Corps Base Pendleton, Naval Station Great Lakes, and Peterson Air Force Base have all been targeted for attacks similar to what we faced last night. The intelligence patterns are identical: inside information, coordinated surveillance, professional assault teams. Major General Kane studied the tactical analysis with growing alarm. You're describing a systematic campaign against military installations across the country. How did we miss this pattern? We didn't miss it, sir, Walsh replied. Someone has been tracking it and disrupting it for years. Sergeant Adams's movements over the past 8 years correspond exactly with the threat timeline. She's been one step ahead of this terrorist network, identifying their targets and ensuring those bases were prepared for attacks that were never officially predicted. The revelation transformed the atmosphere in the debriefing room. What had appeared to be unauthorized freelancing was revealed to be systematic counter-terrorism operations, conducted by someone with access to intelligence patterns that official channels had failed to recognize. General Morrison reopened her file and consulted a new section that had been added during the night. "Sergeant, are you telling us that your 8-year operation has been focused on preventing a coordinated terrorist campaign?" "Yes, ma'am," Allison confirmed. "After Kunar Province, I was recruited by elements within the intelligence community who recognized that conventional counter-terrorism approaches weren't adequate for emerging threats. My official death provided perfect cover for operations that needed to remain completely deniable." Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. A ghost operative tracking terrorist networks and preparing defenses at targeted installations. "It's either brilliant or completely insane." "It's both," Colonel Hayes interjected. "But it worked. Last night proved that 8 years of preparation can prevent a massacre when conventional intelligence fails to identify the threat in time." Major General Kane was studying ballistics reports with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Sergeant Adams, the weapon modifications on the rifle you used last night, who designed them?" "I did, sir," Allison replied. 8 years of different rifles, different conditions, different challenges. Each assignment taught me something new about long-range precision shooting. The modifications represent the accumulated knowledge of dozens of different scenarios. The scope adjustments alone represent innovations that could revolutionize sniper operations, Kane continued. The ballistics calculations, the environmental compensation factors, this is advanced research that typically requires teams of engineers and months of testing. "Sir, I had 8 years and 17 different testing environments, plus the motivation of knowing that soldiers' lives would depend on getting it right." General Morrison made a decision that would reshape how the military approached unconventional operations. "Sergeant Adams, I'm going to propose something unprecedented. Rather than attempting to reintegrate you into conventional military structure, I want to formalize your current role. Official recognition as a special operations asset with authorization to conduct the kind of shadow operations you've been performing." The offer was staggering in its implications. Official acknowledgement of ghost operations, formal authorization for activities that had been completely deniable, integration of shadow assets into mainstream military planning. "General," Allison said carefully, "that would require explanations. About 8 years of operations that were designed to remain secret." "Sergeant, what happened last night made secrecy impossible. 6 terrorist operatives eliminated by a sniper who doesn't officially exist. That's going to generate questions that require answers. We can either control those answers or let others create their own explanations." Colonel Hayes understood the strategic implications immediately. "Ma'am, if we formalize Sergeant Adams's operations, we create a new category of military asset. Special operations personnel who can operate completely outside official channels while maintaining full military support and authorization." "Exactly," General Morrison replied. "The ghost becomes official, but the operations remain hidden. We get the best of both worlds: deniability when needed, accountability when required." As the debriefing continued into the afternoon, it became clear that the events at Camp Morrison had triggered a fundamental reassessment of how the military approached unconventional threats. The ghost sniper who had saved hundreds of lives in a single night had also demonstrated the value of shadow operations that could adapt to threats faster than conventional command structures. But the most important outcome wasn't tactical or strategic, it was personal. After 8 years of living in the shadows, carrying the weight of Tommy Richardson's death and the responsibility for protecting soldiers who never knew she existed, Allison Adams was finally coming home. The ghost was about to become officially invisible, and that paradox might just revolutionize how America defended itself against enemies who operated outside conventional warfare 6 months after the night that changed everything. The memorial wall at Fort Bragg bore witness to an unprecedented ceremony. For the first time in military history, a name was being removed from the honored dead, not because of administrative error, but because the soldier had returned from the shadows to serve again. Staff Sergeant Allison Adams stood before the black granite wall where her name had been etched for 8 years, surrounded by family members who had mourned her death and military personnel who had heard whispered stories of the ghost sniper. The autumn North Carolina air carried the weight of years of separation and the promise of a future that no one could have predicted. "Today we correct the record," announced General Morrison, addressing the assembled crowd of Rangers, family members, and Pentagon officials who had gathered for what the military was calling a status correction ceremony. Staff Sergeant Adams was never truly lost. She was serving in ways that we couldn't acknowledge until now. Allison's sister, Rebecca, stood with tears streaming down her face as she watched the military formally acknowledge what the family had hoped for but never truly believed, that Allison had survived Cunard Province and had been protecting others for 8 years. Their parents, who had aged a decade in the months since learning their daughter was alive, held each other as they processed the complex emotions of grief transformed into joy. "The hardest part," Rebecca said quietly to Captain Walsh, who had become something of a family liaison during the complex process of Allison's reintegration, "was accepting that she couldn't contact us. 8 years of wondering, 8 years of hoping, 8 years of not knowing whether she was dead or just gone." Walsh nodded, understanding the family struggle. "She wanted to contact you more than anything, but her cover required complete separation from her previous life. One phone call, one email, one moment of weakness could have compromised operations that were protecting thousands of soldiers." The ceremony included a presentation of the newly created Shadow Operations Medal, a classification of service that had been invented specifically to acknowledge personnel who served in ways that couldn't be traditionally recognized. Allison was the first recipient, but military planners knew she wouldn't be the last. The success of her 8-year operation had convinced Pentagon leadership that ghost assets were essential for modern warfare. Colonel Hayes, now promoted to Brigadier General in recognition of his handling of the Camp Morrison incident, presented Allison with official orders that would reshape how the military approached unconventional operations. "Sergeant Adams, you are hereby assigned to the newly created Special Operations Shadow Division, with authorization to conduct classified operations in support of military installations facing asymmetric threats." The assignment was revolutionary. Allison would have official military status but would operate outside conventional command structures. She would have access to unlimited resources, but would answer only to a classified oversight committee. She would be officially acknowledged, but would maintain operational invisibility when required. "It's the perfect paradox," Major General Kane explained to the assembled media, who were being briefed on the new military program, without specific details about Allison's background. "We have soldiers who exist officially but operate unofficially, providing security that enemies can't predict or counter." But for Allison, the most meaningful moment of the ceremony came when she was reunited with Corporal Michael Torres, her former spotter who had carried the guilt of leaving her behind in Cunard Province for 8 years. Torres, now a sergeant first-class instructor at the Army's sniper school, had requested permission to attend the ceremony, specifically to close a chapter that had haunted him since Afghanistan. "I thought I left you to die," Torres said quietly, as they stood together away from the crowd. "For 8 years, I've been carrying that weight, wondering if I should have stayed, wondering if I could have saved you." "You did save me," Allison replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You got the intelligence out. You told them what happened to the team. Your debriefing was what allowed them to extract me 3 days later. If you hadn't made it out, no one would have known to look for survivors." The reunion was emotional for both soldiers, but it also served a larger purpose. Torres would become Allison's primary liaison with conventional military units, helping to coordinate between official operations and shadow activities. His experience with her tactical methods and his credibility within the sniper community made him the perfect bridge between the visible and invisible aspects of military service. The new Shadow Operations Division was already planning its first official mission. Intelligence had identified a terrorist cell operating in the Pacific Northwest, conducting surveillance on military installations and defense contractors. Traditional law enforcement and military units were constrained by jurisdictional limitations and legal restrictions, but a ghost operative could gather intelligence and disrupt operations in ways that conventional forces couldn't. "The rules are different now," General Morrison explained during a classified briefing at the Pentagon. "We're facing enemies who don't respect boundaries, who operate outside legal frameworks, who use our own openness against us. Sometimes the only way to fight shadows is with shadows." Allison's first official mission would take her to the Seattle area, where she would operate under the cover of a defense contractor conducting security assessments. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She would be returning to the same type of cover identity she had used for 8 years, but now with full official authorization and support. The technological resources available to the Shadow Division were unprecedented. Custom weapons designed specifically for long-range precision shooting, advanced surveillance equipment that could operate undetected for months, communication systems that were completely untraceable, and extraction capabilities that could remove an operative from any situation within hours. "We're giving you everything we should have given you 8 years ago," Captain Walsh said as she briefed Allison on the equipment and support systems. "Real-time intelligence, backup assets, medical support, and most importantly, the knowledge that you're not operating alone." But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. For 8 years, Allison had carried the weight of unsanctioned operations, knowing that if anything went wrong, she would be completely disavowed. Now she had official backing, legal protection, and institutional support for activities that had previously existed in a gray area between heroism and treason. The medal ceremony concluded with a moment that captured the essence of what the Shadow Operations Division represented. Allison stood before the memorial wall one final time, not as a grieving comrade visiting the dead, but as a living soldier who had spent 8 years proving that sometimes the best way to honor the fallen is to ensure others don't join them. "Staff Sergeant Richardson," she said quietly, addressing the name carved in granite 3 rows below where her own had been removed. "I kept my promise. I made sure it didn't happen again." She placed a small ranger tab at the base of the wall, not Tommy Richardson's original tab, which she would always carry, but a new one representing the completion of a mission that had taken 8 years to finish. As the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed, Allison found herself standing with her family for the first time in 8 years. The conversations were difficult, filled with explanations of why she couldn't return, why she couldn't contact them, why she had to let them believe she was dead. But they were also filled with understanding, pride, and the complex emotions of a family learning to live with a daughter who was both a war hero and a government secret. "What happens now?" her mother asked, still struggling to process the transformation of grief into pride. "Now I do officially what I've been doing unofficially for 8 years, Allison replied. "I protect people who don't know they need protection. I prevent attacks that would otherwise succeed. I watch over soldiers who will never know my name, but who will go home to their families because someone was willing to operate in the shadows." The sun was setting over Fort Bragg as the Adams family walked together toward the base housing where Allison would spend her last night before reporting to her new assignment. 8 years of separation were ending, but in many ways, the most important work was just beginning. The ghost sniper had come home, but she would never stop watching over the soldiers who served in the light while she protected them from the Yavin. Darkness. Staff Sergeant Allison Adams was officially back from the dead, and America's enemies would never see her coming. In the hills surrounding military bases across the country, new shadows were stirring. The Shadow Operations Division was just getting started, and the ghost who had proven that one sniper could change everything was ready to teach others how to serve in the spaces between official and unofficial, between visible and invisible, between the living and the dead. The legend had become real, and the real had become legendary. Somewhere in the distance, another impossible shot was waiting to be made. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.